For more than a century, French armies lived under the shadow of a single fear: the English longbow. Time after time, battles that should have been French victories instead turned into humiliating defeats, all because of thousands of archers standing behind stakes in muddy fields. Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt became not just military disasters, but national scars. Two French knights men raised to believe that armored courage defined the fate of kingdoms, the longbow seemed like an unfair weapon, something that robbed them of the honor of close combat and cut them down before they could even raise a sword. But the story of how France finally overcame the weapon that had once crushed them is not simply a tale of revenge. It is a story of adaptation, reform, patience, leadership, and a complete transformation of French warfare. To understand how France ultimately defeated English longbowmen, we must begin at the moment when the longbow seemed unbeatable. At Crécy in 1346, the French knightly charge collapsed under a storm of arrows. Horses panicked, formations broke, the French lost control of the field long before their swords even touched the English line. At Poitiers, 10 years later, the lesson was repeated with painful clarity. Charles of Blois and the nobility charged uphill through broken ground, and the English, prepared and disciplined, forced them into a narrow killing zone where archers shot in overlapping patterns. Again, the French fought bravely, but without coordination or patience. And at Agincourt in 1415, the mud, the narrow field, and the English defensive setup turned the battlefield into a trap. French knights advanced tightly packed, struggled to move, and collapsed into a mass where they could barely lift their weapons. The English longbow didn't just win these battles, it shaped the entire course of the war. By the early 1400s, it seemed like France might collapse entirely. Much of the north was under English control. Burgundy, once a French ally, supported English claims. The French crown was weakened by internal divisions, political rivalries, and financial strain. Yet these very pressures forced France to rethink everything about how it fought. If the longbow was too powerful for traditional knightly tactics, then the French needed to develop a new way of making war. The turning point came with a generation of leaders who were not bound by the assumptions of the past. They studied English methods, recognized their strengths, and sought to counter them not by charging harder or faster, but by changing the structure of the French army itself. One of the first major reforms was the increased use of disciplined infantry trained to hold formations under missile fire. Instead of relying on massed cavalry charges glorious but inflexible, the French expanded their use of crossbowmen, handgunners, and pike formations. These troops could engage longbowmen more effectively, support cavalry, and control the battlefield in ways earlier French armies could not. Another essential development was the rise of artillery. Gunpowder weapons had appeared in Europe before the 100 Years' War, but France invested in them on a level unmatched by England. Large cannons, small handheld guns, and field artillery gradually became central to French strategy. Castles that once anchored English defensive lines fell in months, then in weeks, because cannon fire made traditional fortifications vulnerable. Artillery gave the French a powerful answer to English longbowmen. Instead of trying to close distance under arrow fire, they could simply bombard defensive positions until longbowmen were forced to move, retreat, or break formation. But technology alone did not win the war. The French army had long been plagued by a lack of discipline and coordination. Feudal levies came and went according to their own schedules, noble commanders competed with each other, and armies dissolved before achieving long-term goals. In the mid-1400s, French kings, especially Charles VII, created permanent, professional fighting forces. The compagnies d'ordonnance were some of the first standing cavalry units in Europe, paid, trained, and controlled directly by the crown. Alongside them were the Franks archers, infantry units drawn from across France and maintained on a semi-professional basis. This new organization changed everything. For the first time, France had forces that could be deployed rapidly, coordinate effectively, and fight with consistency. French soldiers gained experience that matched and eventually surpassed English veterans. Instead of meeting the English only in grand set-piece battles, they waged coordinated campaigns of sieges, raids, and maneuver warfare. They pressured supply lines, reclaimed territory piece by piece, and forced the English into defensive positions they could not maintain forever. As these reforms took hold, French commanders grew more adept at neutralizing longbowmen. They learned to force the English into unfavorable terrain, to use artillery to break defensive stakes, and to protect their own advances with shields, pavises, and combined arms formations. Most importantly, they refused to be lured into reckless charges. The patience that had eluded French armies for decades became one of their greatest strengths. All of these changes came together in the final phase of the 100 Years' War, when France began reclaiming territory at a stunning pace. One of the most symbolic turning points was the French victory at Formigny in 1450. Here, the English held a defensive position supported by hundreds of longbowmen. In earlier generations, this setup would have spelled disaster for any French advance, but the French had brought artillery. Their cannons hammered the English line, forcing longbowmen to abandon their positions and counterattack. This disrupted the English formation and exposed them to a French cavalry charge, not a desperate, disorganized assault, but a coordinated strike at exactly the right moment. The English line buckled, then collapsed. For the first time, France had decisively beaten English longbowmen in a battle that looked nothing like Crécy or Agincourt. 2 years later, in 1453, the Battle of Castillon delivered the final blow. Here, the English army attempted to relieve a siege and found itself facing a French force equipped with one of the most advanced artillery parks in Europe. When the English charged believing the French were retreating, they instead ran into fortified positions lined with cannons and firearms. Waves of gunfire shattered the English advance. Longbowmen, once the terror of European battlefields, found themselves outranged, outgunned, and unable to break through. The French held firm, counterattacked, and routed the English army. With this victory, the 100 Years' War effectively ended. Castillon is often considered the first truly modern battle, and it symbolized something larger. The era of the longbow was over. But it would be a mistake to think of these victories as simply revenge. They were the result of learning, adjusting, and transforming. The French did not defeat the longbow by sheer force or anger. They defeated it by evolving beyond the limits of medieval warfare. They built professional armies, they mastered artillery. They adopted new infantry tactics, they prioritized discipline over individual heroism. And they modernized their entire approach to war. This transformation reshaped France itself. The success of the Compagnies doubled on in strength and royal authority and weakened the power of feudal lords. The new taxation system, created to fund permanent forces, gave the monarchy unprecedented stability. Victory in the 100 Years' War allowed France to emerge as a centralized, confident, and unified kingdom. For England, the loss contributed to internal instability that would soon erupt into the Wars of the Roses. Perhaps the most fascinating part of this story is how completely roles reversed. At the beginning of the war, English armies were the innovators, disciplined, flexible, and deadly. French forces clung to outdated ideas of chivalry and battlefield glory. But by the end, it was France that had pioneered artillery warfare, professional armies, and strategic coordination, while England struggled to adapt. The longbow itself did not suddenly become a weaker weapon. It remained powerful, accurate, and terrifying. What changed was the world around it. Armor improved, gunpowder weapons spread. Fortifications changed shape, armies grew more organized, and commanders became more thoughtful. The battlefield that had once favored longbowmen now favored artillery, pikes, handguns, and professional troops. The longbow had shaped an era, but it could not survive the arrival of a new one. In the end, the French triumph over English longbowmen is not just a story about military revenge. It's a story about the power of adaptation. It's a reminder that no weapon, no matter how feared, remains supreme forever. And it shows how nations can rise even from catastrophic defeats if they are willing to learn, reform, and embrace new ideas. By the time the last English garrisons left France, the country that had once suffered its worst nightmares on muddy fields had become one of the most formidable powers in Europe. The longbow had once humbled French knights, but France's transformation ensured that it would never do so again. Through strategy, discipline, and innovation, the French not only overcame the weapon of their greatest defeats, they also ushered in a new age of warfare that would define Europe for centuries to come.